Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. It's been 3 years of tumultuous activity and protests and demonstrations in Egypt. Recently, it has resulted in an election. Yet, if you were looking at the mainstream media and how it's covered the elections, you will see that they have described it as a success story. Here with us today, we are joined by Dina Makram-Edeib. She is an activist and a labor rights researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Germany. But today she's joining us from Egypt. Thanks for joining us, Dina.
Thank you for having me.
Dina, give us a take on how the media has been covering the Egyptian elections.
Well, the media has generally been covering the Egyptian elections as a success story, and of being very happy about the 23 million voters who voted for Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and in general, saying it's a free and fair elections with European observers who were sent to look and check that this was a good election. And now that's the kind of outside story that completely neglects the real story behind this election.
So tell us the real story. How are the people experiencing what has happened in the elections?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, I don't think the Egyptian people were given any choice in that. If you see the level of repression and manipulation of the media, there's basically no place whatsoever for any voice that's other than the ones that's supporting Abdel Fattah al-Sisi since his coup in July. And that on one side, on the level of the media, but also on the level of the street, we have an anti-protest law. I mean, it's almost ironic that after a revolution, we have an anti-protest law that's been put forth under the rule of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's coup, which means that nobody can protest anything that is being said, or basically even the policies or the economic and social structure that's and alliances that are in place. Not only that, we have 41,000 political prisoners since 10 months ago, and that tells you something about the story behind and our ability to kind of come out and say, well, we are really choosing out there. It's not really a choice. The voter turnout rate, the official one, is 44%. Now, that's significantly less than one that was in the earlier presidential elections that we had in 2012. But it also, a lot of people are unable to understand how lots of the polling stations were quite empty, and yet the voter turnout rate is still that high. And it's something we can never prove, but it's your kind of observations that also collective observations of everybody out there. So yeah, I mean, basically the whole kind of fraud of like, this is the most democratic and free election, I think is just really a joke, because what is a free election when you can't protest, you don't have any other voice on the media, and basically you can't even have a say in the kind of social and economic forces controlling the decision making. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is quite known to kind of prostitute Egypt, and I'm using prostitute with all due respect to all the prostitutes actually, but basically trying to bypass the crisis that's imminent and has been imminent since the start of the revolution, the economic and social crisis out there, by trying to get as much money from the Gulf to basically finance the economic program, his economic program. Now, what that only does is delay the crisis and try to give it to the people who come later, and so really in that, with that in mind, I don't see this as a free and fair election. A simple thing for me is that one of the honest, most active and most dedicated activist Mahinur al-Masri is in prison when Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is in power. This really is the truth of this election. I mean, if it was really a free and fair election, one that leads to the progress of this nation, Mahinur would be probably somewhere supporting it. The fact that Mahinur cannot even speak from prison tells us something about what this election are about.
What can the people expect from this newly elected government? How will it unfold? What are your hopes and aspirations given the situation?
Okay, I'll divide both because our hopes and aspirations are really getting lower and lower and lower. We don't know how low we can keep getting, but this is a personal level. I think on an overall level, people have a lot of expectations from Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. There's a lot of this kind of, again, with the media playing a major role in that, of building this idea of the pharaoh that's going to come and save Egypt, or the leader that's going to, pave the way, and so on. There's lots of expectations for necessarily the economic crisis um, um, to, to, to become a bit easier on people, and an expectation that some sense of safety and security will be resumed on the streets. Now, we know that safety and security can be resumed on the streets in different ways. One of them is adding more repression, which is basically what's being done there. We're back to the days of Mubarak, where if you're walking on the streets and you're by a protest, well, if there is somebody who managed to get the permit first, and you're passing by and that you don't look like good to the policeman, they'll pick you up again. So now that for some people is some sense of security, but for some others, I'm not really sure if that really will maintain the long-term safety that we want, and that will come out of people feeling fulfilled. I mean, violence erupts when people are unfulfilled and not really sure where to look for a source of progress and a decent life. So this is on one hand. On the other hand, I imagine what he's going to have to do economically is what he's doing economically is borrow, 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 borrow. It's everybody who can borrow. I mean, some of the most notorious donors, the European, the EBRD, basically European Reconstruction Banks, as I said at the beginning, the Gulf money, anybody that is going to pump money into the economy, is going to try and ease the economic plan for them, because in reality they cannot take the hard ways of really getting economic justice, which is imposing taxation on the rich. We still do not have proper taxation on the rich in this country. This needs a lot of support from the people, because the elite are going to retaliate. Now, he's not going to do that. He's just going to borrow, 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 borrow. Ease some of the crisis, but I don't think a lot of it, because some of it really needs restructuring and economic justice, and give the crisis on to the coming generation, or basically, I think, become broken by the crisis himself.
Dina, what are some of the economic strategies? You're a labor rights activist. What are some of the strategies you think that this government can take up, which would not require it to borrow money?
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff I was saying was progressive taxation. This is basic, but other things are also, the kind of taxation that we put on specific industries that are making a really high profit margin. Some of them are like the most polluting ones, like the cement industries in Egypt. Now you can put even more kind of taxation or without necessarily making investment in Egypt unprofitable or whatever these neoliberal market ideologies tell us. Actually, can remain continuing to make profit, but then pay more taxes. So there is, I mean, on some level, it's like, where do you take the money from and where do you put it to? I would have liked to see, encouraging more kind of cooperatives taking place. I mean, if we are really not able to find the money from, donors, there's definitely lots of money that can be shared internally among people. And we have seen, I mean, the problem is we've seen the kind of, beginning of these examples happening and then being totally smashed by those in power saying, no, 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 this is not profitable, this is not what we want, it's easier to privatize, and so on. So, I mean, there are examples that are quite inspiring, and we need to take them on and to kind of try and replicate them. And overall, the basic things that you'd see in anywhere is kind of, have a bit more economic justice, take a bit more from the rich and give a bit more from the poor. Now, that's not easy. You need a lot of popular support for that, and you need a really mindset that looks at economic justice.
Speaking of popular support, and given that you're a labor rights activist again, what are the developments in the labor movement? What are some of the leading labor unions, and what are they proposing under the current circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, it's very divided, and it's important to see that. There's a lot, as much as there is really fascinating protests and collective actions by workers that are very progressive in their demands, and I'll talk in a minute about them. There's also, unfortunately, an attempt from the state and specifically from Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's regime to kind of co-opt the labor movement. So you would have heard of this initiative that they try to promote among workers, which is asking them to stop protesting, okay, as if protests were basically the source of all evil, which is really the rhetoric that has been going on since the beginning of the revolution, blaming the workers for their protests, for making things slow down, not blaming the rich for basically taking too much. So on that level, there was a form that was signed by lots of unions and lots of federal unions as well, that kind of supports that workers are going to stop protesting for Egypt, until things are kind of security is resumed and there is an elected government and elected president. Now, this is the bleak picture, and against that bleak picture, we have workers that continue to fight, and they're really fascinating in their fight. Some of them, for example, are some really good examples that are not often known are ones where the workers had been, the plant had been privatized under Mubarak, and then since the revolution, the deals of this privatization were looked at again, and they were quite unfair, so they were revoked by the court, and workers managed to take back these plants and to run them back, sometimes run them back even without management, sometimes offering the states that they actually buy the plant themselves, that workers buy the plant and run it themselves. Again, always difficult to convince the state of these alternatives. But really fascinating examples of people who have stood up continuously, saying that there are alternative forms of doing things. Some of the demands are just what we know them. Demands to get paid decently, demands to get stable contracts and so on. And even if when they seem just quite not radical enough, they are quite radical enough because in the kind of bleak situation where we are in, and where you can't protest and can't get the permit to protest. This is fascinating. It's fascinating that they continue to do it, and they continue to do it taking the risk of just being jailed themselves and their own lives, putting basically their own lives at risk. So yes, we have the two currents taking place, and we'll see what will happen with whether the fascist sides that we've seen erupting since last July will continue to rise further and kill the labor movement, or whether we continue seeing the resistance actually making gains by the day.
Dina, thank you for joining us on the Real News Network, and I hope you come back and continue to give us some reports on the developments in Egypt.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.